gift of grace is Jesus my Redeemer. There is
Now we come to one of my favorite chapters in the whole Bible, Philippians chapter 2. Not just because it's a great chapter, which it certainly is, but because it's also beautifully balanced and symmetrical all around a single theme. Just look at the symmetry of this. In verse 1 to 4, Paul makes a plea to the Philippians. In verse 5 to 11, he gives them an example. In verse 12 to 16, he makes a plea again. And in verse 19 to 30, he gives them 3 examples. And all around a single theme. What is that theme? Well, it's found in the first section. In 1 to 4, Paul makes a plea, and he repeats that plea about 4 times. But I think it's best summarized in verse 4. Each of you look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. That's the central thought of Philippians chapter 2, and frankly, it's the central verse of the whole book of Philippians. Now, I did many weddings during my time in the ministry. I think somewhere between 150 and 200. I never counted. With every couple, I spent about 4 hours giving them hopefully some useful guidance on how to have a good marriage. But at the end of those 4 hours, I would always say, now, it's been nice to do this together, and I hope it's been helpful to you, but it's actually been unnecessary because I can tell you in one simple sentence how to have a successful marriage. And I would quote Philippians 2 verse 4. Each of you put the interests of the other above yourself. My wife instinctively saw this before we got married. We each took the other's ring and we had inscribed inside it a Bible reference. And I think she chose the better one. She chose Philippians 2, 1 to 17. Knowing instinctively that the secret of a successful marriage is to put the interest of the other above your own. So simple. Why do we find it so difficult? So why should we put the interests of others above ourselves? And the answer is because Jesus did. And that brings us to the second section, verses 5 to 11, the example of Jesus. Paul quotes an ancient hymn. Now, we don't know what the tune was to that hymn, so we can't sing it, unfortunately. But it was a hymn that came in 2 stanzas, and I'm going to color the first one in red because it deals with the blood, the suffering, the humiliation of Jesus, who became obedient even unto death. Many songs have been written about that. Like a rose trampled on the ground, he took the fall and thought of us above all. Jesus put the interests of us above his own. And then the second part of the hymn I've covered in gold because that talks about the exaltation of Jesus. God gave him a name above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven, on earth, and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Things above the earth, that refers to the millions of angelic beings and spirits that serve God. Things on the earth is referring to the millions, billions of human beings. Things under the earth refers to principalities and powers, spirits that serve Satan. All of them will bow the knee and acknowledge Jesus Christ is Lord one day, to the great horror of some and to the great joy of others. And so the red and the gold, perhaps illustrating what James said, whoever exalts himself will be abased, but whoever abases himself will be exalted. There are so many hymns written about these themes. One of my favorites for many years was Crown Him with Many Crowns, which covered the red and the gold. Currently, my favorite is one called Is He Worthy by Michael Sanchez. Do yourself a favor, go to YouTube and Google Pastor Andy Luke, Is He Worthy? And you will find a version of this with titles attached. You won't be sorry. And then we come to the third section, verse 12 to 18. Paul again makes a plea, basically the same plea in different words. He says, do everything without grumbling and complaining. When we grumble and complain, we actually become very ugly. We sound like a bunch of sick cows. Grumbling is a sure sign that I have lost sight of the truth that everything I have is a gift. I'm owed nothing. Everything is a gift. And grumbling is a sin of ingratitude against God. And it's a very serious thing. Now, down the years, I've not got the feeling that Christians regard it as a very serious sin. Now, when I was a young guy, if a girl got herself pregnant before marriage, it shook the church to its foundations. People would say, do you know what's happened? It's not like that anymore. The world has changed. I'm not sure if it's for the better. But you never had the church shaken to its foundations when someone grumbled or complained. People didn't say, did you hear what Mrs. Grundy did? She complained. No, it just seemed to be taken in its stride, as if it wasn't nearly as serious as a girl getting pregnant. I'm not sure God sees it that way round. Grumbling is a sign that I'm putting my own interests above the interests of others. It's a shame to live the self-life in the family of God. And then in verse 12, Paul tells us how to avoid that. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you both to will and to act according to his good purpose. There's a wonderful circularity here. In the beginning, God gives me salvation. I can't do that for myself. But then it becomes my responsibility to work out that salvation in practice. And as I do, God in turn works in me to give me the desire and the strength to do his will. It's a wonderful cycle. But when I don't keep responsibility for my side, it becomes like a machine where one of the cogs has got some teeth missing and it begins to shudder and eventually it fails. Paul says do it with fear and trembling because it's a serious thing. He says of himself, I discipline myself, lest having preached to others, I myself should be disqualified. This business of not grumbling, of putting the interests of others above ourselves, is not something to be toyed with. And then we come to the last section where Paul gives 3 examples of people who have put the interests of others above their own. First, he chooses himself, and he says, I am being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice of your faith. Paul is giving everything for the sake of others. And that pouring out is almost an image of it. I'm almost finished. I'm almost empty. I'm not sure if I can carry on, but I will carry on because he puts the interests of others above himself. And then there was Timothy. Paul says, everyone else looks to their own interests. There it is, the description of the worldly way. Look to your own interest. But Timothy has proved himself otherwise. Timothy was a young man, and he wasn't a very well man. And yet faithfully he served Paul in prison. And then there's Epaphroditus. In my Bible study this week, someone very seriously put up their hand and said, I want to give thanks to God that my mother never gave me a name like Epaphroditus. But Paul says, Epaphroditus risked his life to serve me. Indeed, he was ill almost unto death. I think, by the way, that gives us just a little insight into what prison life was like. Roman prisons were extremely filthy, unhealthy places. And the Romans didn't care. Many people died in prison. They didn't care. And Epaphroditus knowingly went into the prison situation to help Paul. And he did catch terrible germs and nearly died. But he put the interest of another above himself. It's wonderful when people do that. I am so grateful down the years for people who have put my interest above their own. Do you know, in the 40 years of my ministry, including my retirement, I've always had somebody who prayed for me every day. There were 3 different people through the years, one of them to this day. I count that a tremendous privilege. It's wonderful to get a gift like that, isn't it? And we want to prove ourselves worthy of such gifts.